we'll do a quick little intro here and then roll from there. Welcome to Designing in Color's 2020 webinar series, The GRIOT, Episode 3. Today is the first installment of hopefully a few in our series where we are blessed to have a guest from outside DCo. Our guests have graciously offered their expertise on this episode's micro topic. Each individual in our lineup has dedicated their practice within the discipline of storytelling and furthers our collective's investigation and promotion of sacred space in design. Thus, I am honored to introduce today's guest, and perhaps our most well-known within the lineup, author, activist, mother, and I believe grandmother, Sisonke Msimang. Hello, Sisonke.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
Myself, DCo. So glad to have you.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
This is beyond our wildest dreams, especially with your ungodly schedule. You were supposed to be in Italy right now, so this is.
I was supposed to be in Lombardy, which is the hardest hit COVID region, unfortunately, in Italy. So we'll postpone and do it at a time that works better for everyone in the world.
Wonderful. And I think earlier you mentioned shelter in place has sort of been lifted where you are.
That's right.
Can you give a little, where are you at right now?
Sure. So I live in Perth, Australia, and Perth is one of the most remote cities in the world, which is usually a real drag because it takes so long to fly anywhere from Perth. But I have to say, in the last couple of months, I've really appreciated being in the most remote part of the world. So we still have a number of restrictions, obviously. We're still practicing social distancing. On Sunday, cafes and restaurants will reopen with limited numbers of people allowed in them. And gatherings of up to 20 people will be allowed outdoors and 10 people indoors. And the kids are back at school. So we're slowly starting to get back to whatever a new normal will look like. And we obviously, are doing well in terms of dealing with the virus itself. So very few new cases, 0 new cases in our state in the last week, and just a handful of cases across the whole of Australia.
That's absolutely wonderful to hear, especially everyone's safe and healthy. Although I do have to ask, you said new normal. Absolutely. Your daughter celebrated a birthday a couple weeks back. So happy belated birthday to her. How was this a non-normal birthday for her?
It was interesting because she was turning 12, and we talked about what should we do. And normally we would have been in South Africa actually for her birthday because we go every year and we go around Easter and we spend the school holidays there. And of course we couldn't travel. So she was feeling a bit sad about not being with her cousins and her grandpa and all that stuff. So I said, well, I really, we can still have a party, but we can do a socially distant party. So we had cupcakes instead of a cake, so that each of her friends could take the cake away with them. And we put a trestle table in front of the on the sidewalk, and each of her friends, and we gave them a time slot and said, come between 11 and 2, and you can do a walk by, grab your cupcakes, and we got her a little Polaroid camera, so she took pictures of her friends as they waved and said happy birthday. So it was very sweet. Sweet.
That is absolutely sweet. I like the time slots. I don't think most almost teenagers are going to be very responsive of sticking within a time slot. So I commend you with that sort of resilience, being a parent in general. That clearly comes from years of practice and learning the nuances.
She was very. It was a collaboration. It was like all good design. It was a very collaborative process.
I am all about that. That is a great word, collaborative. Wonderful. So everyone, that's Sisonke. Just a little background on here. In this episode, we're going to be talking about and really focusing on storytelling and placemaking. For those who may not know, Sisonke is currently the head of oral storytelling at the Centre for Stories in Perth, in Western Australia, where she lives. The Centre for Stories cultivates stories that inspire thought, spark empathy, and challenge intolerance not to mention collaborate, as she just mentioned, with the focus on empowering people whose experiences and perspectives are often marginalized amongst many other missions that you guys take on. She is a 2012 Yale World Fellow, 2014 Aspen Institute New Voices Fellow, and a 2015 recipient of the Ruth First Fellowship from Wits University in Johannesburg, which I have to commend is also the alma mater of a couple Nobel laureates, including Nadine Gordimer and one Nelson Mandela, who you may know
Good
of.
company. I'm in good company.
That's fantastic company, yes. But that's not enough. Sisonke is also the author of a pair of books, including Always Another Country, a memoir of exile and home, published in 2018, an esteemed narrator with The Moth Presents, and spotlighted social justice champion of her 2016 TED Conference talk, which is how most of us know of her up front, on the power of storytelling, inspiration, intentionality, which I think has at least 1.5 million views right now, and actually got my mom to ask what is a TED Talk, so this is great.
Wow, I'm so impressed. I sound so impressive when you describe me like that. I don't recognize myself. Wow.
It is when you combine all the Google results of you and ask you a few tidbits, yes. Impressive. That's why we are so humbled.
That's very funny. Oh, that's great. Who knew that I was this person?
Mm-hmm. All it takes is someone else across the world talking about you. A South African writer, her work centrally gravitates towards the threads of race, gender, class, democracy in African and global culture, which is partly why I think she's happy to reach out to us here in Detroit. And she's been featured internationally, you name it, New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, Al Jazeera. So with this sort of amazing core, you can see why her parallels and ours, we're so excited to have her with us this evening. So that's an impressive mouthful. You even were impressed yourself when I was repeating it. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that fantastic, glowing introduction, but also, more importantly, just for, having the conversation.
That's what we're here for. We're going to have a really beautiful conversation in DCo's GRIOT episode 3. So focusing on placemaking as it relates to storytelling, and that's why we brought Sisonke in tonight. Our field as makers of meaningfulness and meaningful spaces, architects, urbanists, designers, placemakers, the term narrative is frequently thrown around, often quite carelessly. And you being someone who's an expert in the quality of sharing that narrative and storytelling, I'd like you to give everyone here a bit more than just the resume. If you could start a bit with your background and even your story specifically.
Sure. So, my background is a bit unusual. I grew up in many different parts of the world. My father was a freedom fighter. I was actually writing something recently, and I was recounting a story, of being a kid. And one of my father's best friends was a New Yorker. He was actually born in New Jersey, but he was part of the Rikers 21, the Black Panthers who spent more than a year in prison on Rikers Island before the FBI dismissed the charges against them because they were trumped up charges. And so Uncle Curtis moved to Zambia, and he was a microbiologist. He actually helped to invent the treatment for sleeping sickness. And so Uncle Curtis, I grew up with Uncle Curtis in our living room, and with a whole bunch of revolutionaries always in and out of our house. And so I very much had an eclectic childhood. We lived in Lusaka because my father left South Africa when he was just a very young man, when he was in his early 20s. And he went to Moscow to train, military training, and then came back to Africa, went to Tanzania, set up a camp for the African National Congress, and then found his way back to Lusaka and met my mom, and that's where my sisters and I were born. So grew up in a very kind of revolutionary household. And then when we were 10, when I was 7, moved to Nairobi, lived in Kenya for a few years, and then my mother realized that we needed to have a passport, a citizenship. We were stateless kids. And so we moved to Canada. And Canada was very good to us. And we lived in Canada at a time long before there was all this backlash against migrants. At a time when it was recognized that if you were a child who was stateless, then you deserved a country. Every child deserves a citizenship because that gives you all these other things that you can have when you have a citizenship, a place to be educated, a place to call your own. And so Canada gave us that. And then we moved again, and we lived in, when I was 14, we moved back to Kenya and lived in Nairobi until I went to college, and then went to college in the United States, in the Midwest. So I know very well the weather in Detroit.
You're a Great Lakes kinship here. I'm all about it. So
absolutely. So I lived in Minnesota in my college years, and went to Macalester College, which is a fantastic liberal arts college. And then I went and moved to Oakland, lived in Oakland for about a year, and then finally went back home to South Africa because Nelson Mandela had become president and everything was opening up and the whole society was changing. So that's my sort of backstory. And that, it's a kind of a long introduction, but it is a way of explaining the fact that I'm constantly interested in the world and interested in people from many, many different places. And I'm interested in stories from all of those places and from many more.
I think it really changes, diversifies a perspective when you have so many things to compare against so quickly in such a young age. So I think it's really important. That's why I had offered you to start off with that, because that basically, for my gut, and I've read your book, some of our audience members, I encourage you guys to read Sisonke's book. Wonderful piece. And I'm not going to ask a ton of questions about it, but I think a lot of the stuff that you will speak of is going to sort of flow from that very personal story. So you do bring up the sort of placelessness in the book, and I do want to commend you. It's something very challenging to be aware that young of an age, let alone to have the vocabulary to dictate and describe those experiences. I definitely didn't have that sort of level of awareness until much later in life. So could you sort of talk about that, the appearance of placelessness, or the sort of absence of that place growing up, that's helped you become a better storyteller?
Yeah, look, I think when I was a kid, I would have described myself using those words. I would have talked about placelessness. I would have talked about wanting to belong somewhere. And I think the older I get, the more I've realized that when you don't grow up in one place and you are denied the opportunity to belong in that one place, if you're lucky, and I was lucky, you have the opportunity to think about the world as yours. And so you invert that situation. You think about the world as yours and that you belong to the world. And I think that's a very different than relationship that you have to places. And it can be a very deep and connected relationship that you have to places and people. It doesn't have to be superficial, but you have to work at it. Because stories live in our relationship with people, right? You can't have a story alone. That concept cannot exist, right? You are a story maker, a storyteller, because you have a relationship with another person. Someone is listening to you, and you learned the aspects of the story that you are telling because you listened to somebody else, right? So storytelling is always relational. And so I think how you think about your place in the world is fundamentally tied to your capacity to tell stories and to hear stories. Place and relation are everything when it comes to storytelling.
Would you say that's the part that captivates you, say, the most, or is each story different in how it captivates you, say?
So because I do a lot of training of storytellers, what I always start with, so for me, the storyteller is more important than the story. So that's the first thing that we always start with. So my process very much is about, okay, let's listen. Tell me your story, and I'm interested in the person, and we start very wide. We talk about everything about the person, as much as they're prepared to share. and then you have this huge, big sort of triangle at the top. And then what you start to do is you start whittling down, so that you're making sense of a series of experiences that the storyteller wants to share. And the reason why I say we start with the storyteller is because a lot of times, I think on podcasts or in, sort of documentary TV or whatever, you hear and you see people focus on the story, and in some ways it doesn't matter what the cost is to the storyteller. And the process of telling stories can be very painful, it can be very difficult. And so my first obligation is always to my storyteller. Are you going to feel okay if you share this story? You don't have to share this story. You have another story to tell. Every person comprises so many different stories, right? You have like 10 million stories that you could tell me because so much stuff has happened to you. The process of helping people to shape their stories is to help them to think about their experiences and make them, to impose a narrative on what happened. That's the thing that you're trying to do, right? And that could happen to any number of stories. And so the thing that I'm always interested in is, are you going to be okay if you put the story out into the world? And if you're okay with it, then let's go. But if you're not, let's just choose another story. What's important is that you're okay. So that to me is what matters the most in storytelling, is that we preserve the person and that we tell the right story for the right time in the right way for that particular person. And if they're not ready, we just do it another time. Low stakes, right? Let's lower the stakes of storytelling.
So as a coach and someone who teaches storytelling, do you identify, and I believe in your book you mentioned your sort of grandmother, Gogo. She is someone that you expressed that noticed an innate ability in you, or sort of travelers, I think you mentioned. Someone that sort of, you may not have realized that sort of knack and talent and awareness, but she did. Have you, as someone who coaches, do you also have people that, aside from her, that have sort of seen those skills within you, and do you see those in the people that you teach, and how do you identify those really sort of subtle abilities and really let them blossom?
So there's no person who can't tell a story. I just haven't met that person. And I do not believe that they exist. So everyone has an innate ability to tell stories. So yeah, my whole philosophy is that everyone and anyone can tell a story. And the issue is never, are you capable of telling the story? The issue is, do you want to tell a story? So I did a story once. So everyone who walks into my into the Center for Stories, we sit on this blue couch and we have a chat, and we talk about the story that you want to tell. And I don't turn anyone back. I don't say you can't do the story. We let the process unfold, and everyone tells a story. Because I think this idea that somehow you have to have certain qualities or skills is kind of aligned to the sense that a story has to sound or look or be presented in a particular way. And, as an African, what I know is that our stories take the form that they are supposed to take. And so with a lot of the storytelling initiatives I've worked with, what they're interested in is telling a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it has a circular arc, and, and that's fine, and that works really well. I mean, we use some of those sort of, structural elements in storytelling training that I do. But if I'm sitting down, as I did a few years ago, with an Indigenous person here in Australia, a Noongar man who's in his 60s, am I really going to teach him a methodology of storytelling that I learned from someone in New York City? No, not really. I'm not going to teach him anything. I'm just going to listen to him tell his story and be like, wow, right? And follow whatever the stream of the story that he wants to tell is. So I think a lot of storytelling is being humble and recognizing that stories come in all of their different forms, and just helping to push it or guide it along where it needs that.
is your family, your husband and your daughter and granddaughter, do they have a desire to go to the center and tell their stories as well? Do they see you as energizing, or is that something that mom does that I don't?
That's something that mom does. So we definitely, both my kids, tell stories all the time, whether it's about, my day, or more importantly, I think the function that storytelling plays in everyday life is about helping us to form memories together. So, there's always that thing that happened in your family that everyone will then, it's an active process of remembering together. That's what a story is, right? A family story or a group story. It's like, oh my gosh, remember that time when? Or wasn't that day hilarious? And then you tell it and you retell it and you retell it. And what you're doing is you're bonding, right? You're formulating something that you share. That's ultimately what we're doing when we're telling stories. We're remembering together out loud. And that's the beauty of it. That's why it's so special and so important.
Would you say that you encourage, the sort of worldview of placemaking and storytelling to, say, your daughter? Seeing as you guys have been generally in Australia for most of her life, other than flying to Africa, she sort of knows it as a second home. How do you encourage that when you have such a different upbringing and are sort of changing the way that you're raising her, if she's not so much as going to jump on mom's coattails and run with it herself?
Yeah, look, I think for if you ask my kids where they're from, they will say South Africa, and that's because it represents the place they love. They were born there. My daughter was 6 when we got here. My son was 3. So their whole life experience is Australia, and yet they completely identify with this other place. And in that way, I think that's definitely the legacy of me, having been someone who lived in so many different places and always wanted to go home. And so in many ways, you pass that thing on to your children. South Africa is the sort of dream for them. At the same time, I think it's so important for parents to let their kids be who they are. And the things that our kids learn from us are never things that we do consciously. The things that kids learn from us are simply in the way that we are. And we have to trust that who we are and what we are trying to do in this world is something that our children learn from naturally. Because I think if I said to my daughter, I really want you to be a storyteller, I want you to know how to tell stories, she, immediate eye roll. Whereas the act of telling stories is what I do, that's what we do as a family. And so that is what that's what she naturally does when she herself is trying to create memory, when she herself is trying to engage with friends, when she herself is, she's a real social justice warrior, that one. She's super into animals, climate change. That's those are her issues of her generation and her time, and that's what she hasn't eaten meat for 2 years. She's very disciplined about all that stuff. So she has a huge conscience, and I think as she gets older, she will figure out the ways in which she uses story to help her with that conscience.
That's wonderful. I hope she didn't struggle too much with the fall fires there. That was had all of our hearts wrenched.
Yeah, that was tough. Luckily, we were on the other side of the country, but certainly as a national crisis, it has continued to be a big issue for all of Australia.
I'll tell her we are on her side of that endeavor.
I'll tell her.
So something also that DCo and Designing in Color we've really focused on this year is the theme of sacred space. And we have gone through a process of not defining what sacred means, what that space is, because we think it is very personal. It's very much one person's subjectivity. So could you give the audience and all of our viewers a little insight into what might be your sacred space? You said always come home, but what does that mean to you? Maybe it's, I think someone has said before, they're happy in a movie theater with no one around them. What is a sacred space to you? And could you, narrate sort of with some really beautiful detail what that might be?
Sure. So for me, growing up in a household of revolutionaries, sort of the idea of my father was never into church. In fact, he was opposed to church. So the kind of classic spiritual experience of religiosity is something that my dad really, really rejected, which is quite unusual. Lots of Africans are very religious. My father was really not. And so we kind of grew up in a household where there was little space given not just to religion, but to thinking about what else? Thinking about the sacred. I think it's something that was neglected, and we neglected in our childhoods because we were so concerned with the existential thing of like survival, of, freedom, of what's the next step in terms of South Africa's freedom. And as I've gotten older, I think I've become a lot more thoughtful about these questions. And so for me, the place that is most sacred is relational. So it comes back to my stories. So what is sacred to me is the trust and bond that I develop when I have my full attention on someone and they have their full attention on me. I think that is such an incredibly powerful thing, to pay attention. So the sacred is attention. It's me really listening to what you're saying and trying to understand who you are, trying to connect with what's happening in your life, in your heart, trying to make sure that I don't misunderstand, and feeling that way about you, feeling that you are similarly concerned with me. And that can happen. The amazing thing is that can happen with any person at any time. So the sacred is always present. It's not like, oh, I'm going to see this person, I'm going to do this thing, and I know that I will have an appointment with something that is sacred. You can be completely surprised by it because you walk into a cafe and you're grabbing your coffee and somebody says something to you and you find yourself immersed in this person, wow, really? My goodness. Or they say something and you think, oh my goodness, wow, that's such an interesting thing to say. And then you look at them and it can even be a moment of like, wow, yeah, I see you and you've seen me. For me, that relational moment where we're paying attention to one another is incredibly beautiful, but also it's very spiritual.
So attention. I'm a yoga instructor. Also, I've been teaching yoga for half a decade now. I'm practicing for almost 13, 14 years. So attention is a really important thing in practicing controlling attention and letting it go. Architects, designers, we are creative people, and so are you. And attention and creativity go hand in hand, and focus and attention do not. Do you have any insights? Because attention is really, and I agree, it's really, really important. Any suggestions to designers, architects, that we could use narrative and attention, or any suggestions in general to build us as better audiences, and help advocate for the storyteller, and not only for the storyteller telling us, but us as a storyteller to others? What could we do to sort of set the stage for that?
I think probably the most important thing is to listen and to quiet the voice inside you that wants to ask questions, because while you're listening to someone tell their story, the questions can interrupt your experience of it. So that's very important, is to be an active listener. And I think that's as important. So if we think about design as a form of storytelling, then what you're doing when you tell the story, when you are creating a design, is you are channeling everything you have listened to and everything you have observed, and you are trying to do that in as authentic a way as possible. I think that's the best that we can do as storytellers. And as an audience, I think the best we can do is to listen. Yeah? It sounds sort of deceptively simple, but it's incredibly difficult to do. It's a thing that I'm always trying to do better, but it's constantly also failing at, right? That's the journey.
That's we are people, and journeys is part of what we do every morning. So
yeah. Yes.
So I do have one last little closing bit. Do you have any story that someone else has shared with you that's really put you in a spot of real emotional comfort that you just know offhand, like you remember something that was said from someone else that's been a really powerful story to you, and what those words might be? And I didn't prompt you with this one to give you a little heads up on this one. From our conversation, a lot of these have been sort of brewing inside of me.
In some ways, I'll probably, go back to not a story that someone told me, because obviously, in addition to kind of the storytelling in the oral sense that I work in and listen to, I'm a writer, and I love reading stories. And probably the kind of most if I think about comfort, the most comforting and probably inspiring thing that I constantly turn to is Toni Morrison's words about if there's a story that you haven't read, you should write it. If there's a story that exists in the world because you have lived it, you should tell it. So for me, that is the probably as close to a motto as I'm gonna get. This idea that we not only that the stories exist that haven't been told, because that's inspiring, right? And because there's so many people who have done such amazing things, and it can be intimidating and overwhelming, and you're like, oh my God, who's gonna write? I can't write as well as Beloved, right? That's an impossible thing. But the notion that there are stories that haven't been told is so fantastic, because it's true. And the reason they haven't been told is because you've lived them and you haven't told them yet, right? So that's amazing. And the fact that you can then do that, for me, that gives me great comfort, and it also, of course, gives me great inspiration.
Well, that's beautifully put. So I think that we'll definitely let you go here. You've been more than gracious with your time. I would like to tell our audience Sisonke's book, Always Another Country, available on Kindle, on Amazon. Go ahead and check it out. Check out her TED Talk. We will post her Instagram handle and website in our caption below. So feel free to check that out. Reach out to her too. She's been remarkable with us tonight. And she is one that I will have to say, because it was just Mother's Day recently here in the States. She dedicated her book to her mom. So if you read her book, of all the stories that come where the parents took her and her being a mom too, she still respects the role of her mom and what her mom gave her as something that was beneficial. And to all the moms out there who may be chiming in, the stories that you know and that you tell your children too are the ones that keep resonating down. So if we're going to change systems in the world, it's a beautiful way to think about the way we parent and what we teach our kids directly. So, Sisonke, this has been just, I'm glowing over here. It's been an absolute pleasure. And we hope you continue to touch base with us, and we reach out to you in our network. And I'm hoping that I can make it to Australia soon. It would be wonderful to.
Fantastic. We will welcome you with open arms.
Yes. if you're in town.
Thanks so much. Of course. Thank you very much, Brian.
We had a Supreme Court justice last week who went in the bathroom and flushed the toilet during a council hearing, and no one can identify which one it was. So the whole joke is like, which one was it? They're very stately people, and they're using the toilet.
Using the toilet. That is so hilarious.